Angie Mahara here. In this video, I just want to come back a little bit around from things I've been talking about in other videos recently to say that, borderline personality, so-called, really poorly named, and even all the other names out there for it aren't really helping because now there's like 5 names or 6 names. But borderline personality is not a serious, quote, serious mental illness, unquote. Are there some people, a percentage of people with BPD more severely affected? Probably that's very, reasonable to say. But how do we delineate that? Well, it's tougher because, like, psychiatry is the the way that psychiatry, their narrative is pseudoscience. So they put out what they want you to believe, maybe what they believe, but BPD is not really a serious mental illness. So what is it then? And I'm just going to touch on this briefly before I get to the point of what happens for people with codependency and BPD and how do people find each other and why. Well, BPD is actually a trauma response, and even in the 25% diagnosed, there's something they perceive as traumatic. So whether perceived or actual, people with BPD are in trauma response that until unless they heal that, and I would say get fully recovered from that, they have what becomes a relational nightmare situation of this trauma-based response. And so codependency is also, it's either adverse childhood experience, meaning something wounding, something painful, but maybe not wholly traumatic, but still very difficult that might have happened to you as a young child or might have been an unavailable parent, etc. But so codependency is also a response to either adverse childhood experience. It doesn't go to the level of the trauma response of so-called, quote, BPD, end quote. But codependency is in its own right a response to trauma. Like I said, varying degrees for different people, but not the level to which those with so-called BPD, the, quote, severe mental illness, unquote. So what am I talking about here? Well, the reality that not only do people with codependency and people with borderline personality who also have codependency, you meet in the middle of trauma, at least on a subconscious level. So codependency and people with BPD form trauma bonds essentially because each has their own trauma. And I'm not saying it's the same or to the same degree. There's a lot of differences, but there's a lot of overlap. And why would I be talking about this right now? Well, because this idea that you can vilify everybody with BPD, that this label is so especially delineating of something horrible in people. And yes, they can really act terribly, abusively, and they abuse and traumatize, partners, loved ones, family members, acquaintances, friends, favorite people, or whatever they call them. So that happens, and wounded people wound people. And people with codependency need to really realize that this narrative that somehow you get victimized and traumatized. That is really important to know and to realize the gravity of and the depth of. And that's why these relationships are so painful. And I would just say briefly that for people with BPD, as it's called, which really is overlappingly so similar to CPTSD, but again, I'm not going to say exactly the same. So just like people with CPTSD as well, where people may have codependency and CPTSD, or maybe not, but often those are overlappingly, they have a correlation of overlapping people's lives because, quote, BPD, codependency, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, everything meets in the middle of trauma. So this is the dynamics of trauma, which essentially, is what is at the base of what trauma bonds are really about. It's a connection, a connection in your life in the here and now as a man or a woman, as an adult. It's a connection on that level, even when people with BPD don't know who they are, or they've lost themselves and have no stable sense of identity, and in many cases, no sense of identity whatsoever. It doesn't mean that the man or woman you see in front of you who has BPD, who you don't know maybe anything about it, or you don't know at the time, doesn't mean there isn't some adult interaction going on there in terms of attraction and what is wanted in relating and getting to know each other. But then, yes, it goes all awry as the trauma of people with BPD comes into how they mirror you, how they want to please you, how they want you to accept them because of all the trauma and the arrested emotional self, that they have lost themselves, and so they don't know any other way to relate. And that's not to excuse abuse or anything of that nature. People with codependency, I know some other people talk about it like, if you're the ex of somebody with BPD, or if you're currently, a partner of, or somebody with BPD, that, and you're going through and you're realizing this isn't working, and you're trying to fight to make it work, and you're still not ready to let go, and it's very painful, and you're being traumatized, and you might not understand that you have a wounded inner child, and that there's some level of your own trauma that adds to the trauma bond. That this trauma bond between codependents and borderlines, or between, codependents and people with CPTSD and borderlines or narcissists for that matter, it's a dynamic. It's a fit on a subconscious level that is only going to trigger both parties in different ways back to their own trauma. It is a very painful connection. And I'll just stick to the BPD codependent trauma bond in this video. Very incredibly painful. And why is it so painful it's painful to go through. It's painful to try to love somebody who's more traumatized than you've been, as you carry around subconsciously your wounded inner child, and they carry around the absence of self that is a split off, fragmented from inner child, that is in a deeper amount of absence but difficulty, and the false self that takes its place in people with BPD. So this idea that in idealization, that somehow people with BPD are doing that on purpose, or they're doing it like a narcissist would do it, or you've been targeted, or they are malicious and calculating, so much so that they seduce you. It forwards a victim narrative, frankly, with all due respect, that if you're seduced, if you feel like you were seduced, as other people out there are saying, you're seduced by the borderline, and they're not who you thought they were, etc. Okay, and so, but they don't make you do anything. They don't make you feel good in the idealization, yes, but you might not realize what's happening. But what's happening is, it's like in the transactional analysis of the interactions of what's really happening, it's becoming a dynamic where two people's trauma overlap. That's essentially, there's more to it, and I'll talk more about trauma bonds. And I have more coming at ajmahari.co. And I have another website coming, which I'll be announcing soon. It's going to be primarily blogs, but also I will be maybe writing first, and maybe doing some of them in podcast, video or audio or whatever over here, and also maybe slight differences from the blog post to what I might put up over here. That way, if people want to hear it versus read it, or they want to go read it versus hear it, So I'll be announcing that website soon. But anyway, back to the focus here, which is, if you are somebody that believes that the person with, quote, BPD, unquote, which really is something, yes, and it's a trauma response, and they have deep and core wounding trauma to the point where they've lost themselves, which, unlike codependency, people can lose themselves in the relationship and in being traumatized by somebody with BPD and essentially re-traumatized in ways they might not realize, because maybe your childhood wasn't as traumatizing, but there's a woundedness there that's getting salt poured in that wound at the same time as you're being re-traumatized. And people with BPD also in the struggle to try to relate without a self, with no self-coherence or cohesion to other, they can't do it. And so no matter what they do in between, they're not looking for supply. They're not narcissists. People, quote, diagnosed with, quote, BPD, unquote, alone are not vulnerable narcissists. It's not the same thing. All these iterations of misinformation are going to do only one thing for you if you don't look for delineating, keeping it real, parsing of authentic understanding that you really need to get to the depths of where you need to go, wherever you are in this journey, whether you're still in a relationship, etc., or whether you're an ex or you got ghosted or whatever happened. And by the way, people with BPD don't discard because they're not narcissists unless they have comorbidity both, and they don't all. Why is that important? Because psychiatry is working through their pseudoscience narrative, and many other people online are just always saying they're the same. And then there's the one out there that says borderlines are just failed narcissists, which is ridiculous. Because there are iterations of not common, but, well, it's all too common today. But the difference between BPD and NPD, vast, okay, and yet is there some overlap sometimes? Yes, even without comorbidity. And what is that? Well, it's infantile narcissistic defenses, which, by the way, shall I be so bold as to go forward and say that people with codependency, where they need to control unbeknownst to themselves often until you become aware of what's going on in your own psychology and you take your own inventory, you are externalizing out much that you need to come back to you from your woundedness in childhood, and not to the same degree or in the same way as a person with BPD. But this is why you can lose yourself so much in these trauma-bonded relationships. And the trauma doesn't just go one way. It goes predominantly, maybe more, codependent traumatized by a person who's been traumatized more with what's called, quote, BPD. But it's a dynamic. Then it becomes two people interacting on essentially three levels, which would be the three aspects of the human ego, or the ego within all of us. And that would be the parent, the adult, and the child, to stick with transactional analysis versus Freudian speak. It's just much more clear, much more accessible. So this is where people with codependency, and many people might not be ready to hear this, though I think many people are, searching for a way out, searching to heal, searching to stop focusing on the person with BPD. And I want to just encourage you today, if this message isn't resonating with you right now because you think, well, I don't want to do, I don't know what you're talking, fine. But if it is, or if it's giving you food for thought, and you want to think about this some more, then I would just gently say to you in a very gentle, challenging way, are you taking your own inventory versus taking that of the borderline? Are you too obsessed on every single video about BPD you can find as accurate or inaccurate as so many of them are inaccurate? People up there saying that people with BPD, quote, it's a serious mental illness, quote, yeah, well, that's the pseudoscience of psychiatry's narrative for sure. But it's not the human context of what's really happened to these people. And a lot of people with codependency still want to forward that they're empaths, and I still have that video coming about busting the narrative of this empath label, that all of these things, what you need to do, and it's painful stuff, and this is what I work with clients on, though. It's family of origin work, it's self-differentiation, it's inner child healing, and all of what that means I'm going to be saying more about as well. But it's so imperative, if you're ready, that you open, as many people on the channel have been commenting, they are ready, and people are joining at ajmahar.co, and I haven't got anything set up there yet. I apologize. I'm going to have that coming very soon. So I've got your membership requests, and I will be, I'm just trying to organize and figure out how to put it all together for you over there. For the online group support for codependents who are ready to recover, go more deeply into their recovery, that's outside the victim mindset narrative. I mean this with all due respect and empathy and no judgment. The victim mindset narrative that the borderline made you feel this way, the borderline did this to you, well, yes, of course they've traumatized you. You're in a world of hurt, and they've impacted you. Yes, I'm not trying to minimize that at all. But what I'm saying is your remedy to your own healing and to getting out of the agony and the suffering and the incredible pain you're in right now, it's not as much about watching endless videos about the borderline, because so many of them are inaccurate to start with. And even if they're not, it's like, okay, so understand a little bit more about that. But every time you make that too much your focus, or you don't balance it with focusing on what you need to focus on for you to heal, move forward and learn more about, you're keeping yourself stuck in suffering and in the pain and the agony. So do people with the trauma response known as, quote, BPD, that pseudoscience of psychiatry says is a, quote, severe mental illness, unquote, I'm not in any way saying that these people aren't very lost and that they don't end up really traumatizing and abusing people. They do. And like I said, I have another website. It's going to be a blog. It's going to be, I'm going to write tons about this, because I don't know about YouTube, but I know, even before I do all the talking in the videos, I'm a professional writer, and I think that I enjoy writing, and it's another vehicle for me to be able to get some information across to people that I hope will help. So the trauma bond, which there's much more, and you may know more about it, or you may not have looked into it yet, but the trauma bond is such that it's really highly not really going, people who skip this part don't have your best interest in mind, okay, or at heart, as I do in keeping it real. I can't tell you anything you're not ready to hear. You won't listen to anything you're not ready to hear. I'm not trying to tell you have to do this or that. But I am here to say that the trauma bond is such that two people come to a trauma bond. It is not formed on one side only or one way only. It is both people bringing whatever levels and degrees of trauma that isn't the same. So codependency and, quote, people with, quote, BPD, unquote, which is really something. I'm just saying it's not psychiatry's narrative of it, because they can't prove that either. But the point is, looking at it in a humanistic context does not mean I diminish it all. The way that they are so traumatized themselves, not an excuse. They need to take responsibility today for their healing, as do people with codependency, for their healing. So the trauma intersects, and it's different levels of trauma. This is what brings codependents together with, quote, well, never mind, quote, just borderlines, but because that's the language we're stuck with right now. So two people, millions of times over, two people come together, they form a trauma bond because they each have trauma. The intersection between the codependent and the borderline is the trauma that each has, that maybe neither is aware of. Subconsciously, the trauma of the wounded inner child and why that is and to what degree that is what brings people together. So there's the adult attraction, but subconsciously this is what brings people together. And the trauma bond formed, what codependents need to realize today is that you have a part of your trauma or adverse experience or some degree, even if it's not a huge degree of trauma, you have your connecting piece of trauma that you are carrying subconsciously within you that connects with maybe the bigger wound, the bigger trauma of the borderline. So it's a dynamic. It's not, and I'm not saying it's 50-50. It could be in some cases, but no. The person with BPD is going to have a lot more relational difficulty. But codependency, being the trauma response that it also is, not to the level of the trauma response known as BPD, means that you weren't just seduced. You made choices. There was other things driving you subconsciously to want this, and it's why people can't let go, among all the other reasons. Why it's so difficult to break this trauma bond is because part of that trauma in the bond is the codependence. It's not all about the borderline. And so in the beginning, as the relationship starts, and then later when you find out they're not really who you thought they were, because no, they don't know who they are, and that's a deeper trauma than codependency. It's really important that you don't believe that the borderline, yes, they'll traumatize you. I want to stress that. And they are traumatized, and they will also be re-injuring and re-traumatizing themselves. And all unknowingly and subconsciously, but they are not vulnerable narcissists, and they are not the same as narcissists. And there's a whole lot more I have to say about this. Keeping it real and parsing it accurately. Best I can say. I'm not speaking about what anybody else has said about anything. But you can't just be seduced by a borderline. Because that's you accepting that you were just a victim. And they did what? They forced you into some physical encounter? I don't think so, right? Especially for men. And I work with a lot of men, and please hear this correctly, and in the empathic way I'm trying to help when I say this. Some men out there that talk about this would have you believe, and maybe some men do believe at this point, and that's what you got to challenge your own narrative and look at your own inventory. If you think a borderline woman, or even a narcissistic woman, although they target a bit more, etc., but if you think that a borderline woman seduced you into whatever happens next and you had nothing to do with it, you're blocking your own way forward. You're blocking yourself in agony and trauma and a false narrative that isn't going to help you to get the healing, to get to the healing and the pain reduction and working through a complex grief process, because there's no closure in these relationships. So I just wanted to do this video to just say, for those who are ready to look at this, because not everybody is, right? And I respect everybody's in whatever place they're in. So the trauma bond isn't just because you, as a codependent, get with a borderline. It's not just because they were traumatized in childhood to a point where, yes, it's been so bad that they've lost themselves entirely. And that's what happens to people with codependency. Not that they lost themselves entirely to whatever the why you have a wounded child inside of you, degree of trauma or level of abandonment, rejection, sensitivity. This can happen. It happens for people with codependency. It does not go to the level of why other people are, quote, diagnosed with BPD, unquote, instead of maybe we really should be forwarding about that. But the point is, it's a dynamic. You weren't seduced like beyond your control to say no. It might have felt like that. But everybody has to take responsibility at the end of the day. Not ever for how you've been traumatized by whomever traumatized you, whether it's a codependent who's been traumatized by a borderline, or the borderline has been traumatized by a narcissistic parent, or a borderline parent, or whatever, what have you. Everybody on all sides of this equation needs to take their own personal responsibility and their own inventory and seek their own healing and recovery journeys, or you're going to get stuck and blocked in the narrative of the misinformation out there that this just all happened to you, and that somehow if you're a codependent, or whether you think you are or not, that you got involved, seduced beyond, somehow you had no choice and you were just totally victimized by this person with BPD. No, you might have been victimized, but you had choice points all along the way, and maybe you weren't consciously aware of them, and maybe you didn't recognize them. So that's where the personal responsibility of codependency is waiting for you to embrace that, as painful as that is, so that you won't be blocked by it and continue to suffer in a victim mindset because you've been victimized. Hope that made some sense. I'm going to be going way deeper, like I said, at ajmahar.co with all this, the dynamics, how you break these trauma bonds, how you actually heal and recover. For people that are ready to do that over there. And when I say that, I don't mean to be insulting or measuring or judging. It's not like that at all. It's just simply information. I'm keeping it real here. It's outside the box. It's not where you're going to hear a lot of other people talking about on YouTube when it comes to the trauma bond between the codependent and the borderline, and what BPD really is and what it means. And it doesn't really matter to some people when you've been traumatized by somebody with BPD, but it will matter in your healing and recovery journey when you can get yourself out of the false echo chamber narrative online, across social media, and on YouTube, that somehow this trauma bond just happened to you as a codependent. No, you have a more active role in it than that. And unless you want to look at that, you're going to continue to suffer. And all the videos in the world are only going to maybe be, in a way, enabling you more and helping you less than you think. Because your focus on the borderline is not the way that you, the codependent, can go forward to heal. So I hope that this gives you food for thought. And it's just an honest message about what people need to come to realize sooner or later. And you might not be there yet. And if you're not, I respect that. And I hope that this doesn't tick you off too much, because it's not my intent at all. But I don't know who's watching. I don't know where people are at. And I choose now to really try to forward. I'm doing all kinds of different videos, but this type of video is really important because there are people who are ready for this message, who need to hear this message for clarity, for validation, to understand more about what maybe they already know somehow but can't put into action, or don't have the bridge to the narrative, if I could put it that way. Anyway, I hope that was helpful to some and not too adverse to others. Take care.